read two things to you. The first is a quote by Francis Weller, who happens to be one of the best bereavement instructors in the country. And it says, grief is subversive, undermining the quiet agreement to behave and be in control of our emotions. It is an act of protest that declares our refusal to live numb and small. There is something feral about grief, something essentially outside the ordained and sectioned behaviors of our culture. Because of that, grief is necessary to the vitality of the soul. Contrary to our fears, grief is suffused with life force. And the second is a quote from a surgeon in Europe who was sending his partner to Harvard for the first time in the United States. And he said, well, the most important thing you need to know about Americans is that they think death and grief are optional. So tonight we will talk about both of those philosophies and see what we think, and whether or not you think that's true. When I start grief groups, I always use the singing bowl. When I worked in Connecticut, my office was on the Long Island Sound, and we did it outside, and we hit the bowl, and the sound goes and goes and goes and goes. So I invite you to close your eyes and gather yourself and let the day go. One of my grief group members said, I like to think that this sound goes on so long that we can't hear it, but somebody we loved picks it up on the other side.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the fourth and final of a four-part series that we've done here at IFMA, Integrative Family Medicine of Asheville. And I'm very grateful to you, Ariana and Liz, for making this possible. Some of you have been to the other sessions. And for those of you who haven't, the first one explored death and dying in America, kind of myths about death and dying, options that are available for end-of-life care in our society. We had a death doula present and an acupuncturist and aromatherapist join us. I'm a hospice physician. I work in an inpatient hospice facility in Asheville. And in the second one, we explored creating an end-of-life care plan. Not only looking at advanced directives and planning for the medical piece, but also looking at how we envision our final days to be. And then the third, we talked about after-death care. So green burials, home funerals, and then traditional funerals. So all of those kind of had the intention of exploring and understanding the options for how we die, we and our loved ones die. Today we'll talk about the way of grief, a holistic look at bereavement. And in my mind, all that preparation we've done, creating a good death, or however you define that, and preparing for your death greatly impacts how those grieve, how our loved ones grieve, and how we grieve, depending on the death of our loved one. So this seminar is about grief, and there are many definitions of grief, and one that I'd like to share with you that I've heard by Stephen Jenkinson. Are you all familiar with him? He's an author, theologian, speaker, and philosopher, farmer. And he says grief is the experience and feelings that accompany seeing the end of something precious to you, experiencing the absence of it. And he talks about how we as a culture are grief impaired and grief illiterate. He says that grief is a skill that we need to learn. It's not something that we just inherit and that comes naturally necessarily, because a lot of it's learned. If you're taught that you don't talk about your emotions, then you won't talk about your emotions, and that's how you will grieve. But we are here to sort of explore different ways of looking at grief. And grief is truly as our own way of grieving, is as individual as our lives and how we live our lives. So I'm honored to have Marlissa Mills. She's had many years of experience in this work, and Sheridan, and they'll give you a little bit about their background as well. So I will pass it along.
I'm going to sit because I have plantar fasciitis and standing is not comfortable. So if you can hear me, I am going to just sit. Social worker, retired social worker, clinical social worker in private practice. I started with hospice in 1979 when Mountain Area Hospice came to Asheville, and I was the only social worker, but that's because we had one social worker, and we had no idea what a social worker in hospice did in 1979, and I was so young that I wouldn't have been able to do it anyway. Nobody that age should be in charge of social work and bereavement because I had had a dog die. I had had one grandparent die when I was very small, and I had a lot of theory and absolutely no experience. And it was frightening that they let me loose, but they did. And I don't know if they learned anything, but I did. So bereavement, the title, is the process by which we grieve and we mourn. And when I teach in hospice, I say bereavement is an important thing to know in hospice because Medicare says you have to be aware of bereavement. And Medicare says we want you to know that grief should only last 13 months because that's all we're going to cover. So we do try to wrap it right up, you know, because after all, we know that it's 13 months. And what that really means is that hospice is aware that grief is a prevailing important thing to look at. But they're also aware they have limited resources. So 13 months is not bad. And for 13 months, we help people grieve, which is the inner feeling, and mourn, which is the outer expression of those feelings. So you have bereavement, and you have grief, and you have mourning. In this culture, we don't do mourning well, and we deny grief frequently. But grief is there whether we deny it or not. It is an inherent, instinctive reaction to loss, and not necessarily death loss, to loss. We grieve over so many things that we lose. And it's there, and unless we learn to deal with it, we're in trouble. If I say to you, what are the 5 stages of grief, who knows? Elizabeth?
I learned it from Elizabeth.
Of course.
In the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
with gangs. And so, denial.
Yes.
Harmony.
Depression.
Something
Depression, and 13 months later, we tie it up with acceptance. Exactly. So that's pop culture, and that's what we learned, and that's because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a pioneer in her field and understood. However, I'm going to tell you to throw that out because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wasn't even talking about grief. She was talking about the grief and the response of the dying patient, not the family. And I was telling Aditi, she said somewhere in a lecture, and I think that applies to family and people too, and we go, oh, there's a theory, you know, and we've held it for 40 years. And today, if you Google the stages of grief, you will find everybody has a theory. We have 6 steps, we have 7 steps, we have 6 R's, we have lots and lots of stages. We have everybody's theory on grief. None of them are wrong, not one, and none of them are right entirely by themselves. The idea that you have to go through all of them is probably correct, no matter what you call it. You can call it the 6 R's, and you can call it reality and come out with reintegration and put 4 R's in between, all of which is accurate. You can call it denial and come out with acceptance. You will start somewhere and you will end, but the idea that anybody is going to go through these in stages is not going to happen. Have you seen the Facebook thing that says, we understand theoretically that grief goes like this, but the truth is grief goes like and then circles back. And that's an interesting point too. and we won't talk too much about that tonight, but there is some very interesting data about whether a therapist really helps grief. The problem with trying to decide what helps grief is that how do you quantify what helps grief? It's not like how much bacteria can we kill with an antibiotic. It isn't like what symptoms disappear. It's really, really subjective about, and grief is not an illness, and it is not a psychiatric diagnosis, and it's not something to be cured, and it's not something to be fixed or hurried. It is a part of life, and the prevailing theory now, and I think that we're getting there, so another 40 years from now we'll talk about it and whether we've made it, is that it may be the gift of a lifetime, because it forces us to say that something in us, in our soul, is important enough. And we are set up in a society and a world and a universe where everything dies and everything changes. Now, if that's the case, then at some point we need to learn to deal with it, or not. And the or not has not served us well. So when we're looking at the holistic approach to grief, we're looking at the fact that grief affects not just emotions, but grief affects emotions. It affects cognitive ability, it affects your social life, it affects your physical life, and it affects your spiritual life. So that's the holistic approach of there is no part of your life that grief will not touch. And any of you in here who are going through acute grief, recent grief right now, know that there is no part of your life that grief does not touch. And yet it still continues to be something that we don't pay much attention to because we don't want to look at it, because that means we have to look at death, and we don't want to look at that either. We used to do better in this society than we do now, but now we have made things, as our technology and our information gathering has improved, our soul tending may have deteriorated. So the challenge is, what do we do next about this? There are all kinds of grief. There is normal grief, whatever that is. You have normal grief, and that just ticks me off when people say that. What's normal grief? Normal grief is serious sadness that does not develop into something more serious like addiction or suicide or something else, and that resolves within a reasonable time. Not necessarily Medicare's time, but a reasonable time. Most people have normal grief. Most people are resilient enough to where with a loss, they will work through it, with or without help. And there is some evidence that the longer you spend in therapy, the worse you get, and we won't talk about that. But that is partially the thought about grief. So normal grief, it works on the theory that people are resilient and that they will find their way out through their own resources and the resources of their culture. Then there's complicated grief. And complicated grief comes from many, many things. And the number one thing about complicated grief is the loss of a child. Now, if anybody can tell me that could be anything but complicated grief, as a mother and grandmother, I can tell you I don't think so. But people make it out of that, and they make it out of that with amazing resilience and with soul power. But it is not easy, because the loss of a child is the loss of so many other things. It's the loss of your future and your hopes and your dreams and your security as you think about all the things you thought about. That's number one in complicated grief. The other complicated griefs are things like people that have a pre-existing mental illness or substance abuse problem can get into trouble. Because grief is not depression, but it can lead to depression, and it can exacerbate depression. So you can have complicated grief that way. You can have complicated grief with all kinds of trauma. So if the death that you're talking about is traumatic, And by traumatic, I mean traumatic to you. I don't mean traumatic to everybody else. And I said to you all the other day, the worst grief I ever saw in any human being was a woman whose 99-year-old mother came into hospice on the last day of her life and slipped out of this world, the simplest I've ever seen. It was a death we would all love to have. No pain, no anything, went to sleep, that was it. The daughter said, I can't believe it. I never thought this would happen. You wanted to say, where have you been? But again, it's a subjective process because to her, it was the worst possible imaginable scenario. She lost her mother. Now, she'd had her for 70 years.
She must have been a caretaker.
She was a caretaker for 10 years. She lost not only her mother, she had the complicated grief of losing her life's purpose, losing her income, losing the house they lived in, losing her last family member. So that leads me to cumulative grief, which is how many griefs can you take, how many deaths, how many losses in a row. We get people in there who just lost everybody in their family within a year's time, and then added their dog. And speaking of which, pet grief is probably as bad as any grief. I think it is too. And I love that it is. I love that we love that much so that pet grief is. But gosh, people get totally dysfunction over losing a pet. And if you lose a pet on top of losing your grandmother and your father and your job and your home and all of those things, that cumulative grief gets complicated. The last grief I want to talk about is disenfranchised grief. Anybody know what that is? I love that. Disenfranchised grief.
It's when you've been exiled.
Absolutely. It is unacceptable social behavior that leads to grief. So let me give you, you'll never forget this, I think. So I was coming into hospice, and I always went about 6:30 in the morning so I could get to the floor when nobody was there. And I was coming out of the elevator, and a woman I had never seen before, very young, beautiful woman, came out of the room of a very powerful politician in Connecticut who was dying. And I thought, granddaughter, niece, great niece. I said, I'm so sorry about your family member. And she said, oh, no, I'm not here. And I said, okay. And she said, he is the love of my life, but his wife and children would not understand it. She was not allowed to be there except at 5 in the morning. She was not allowed to grieve because she couldn't tell anybody that the man that she loved more than anything was dying. That's disenfranchised grief. Suicide is often disenfranchised grief. We're doing better, but we still hesitate to say that somebody in our family died of suicide. Drug addiction and overdose can be disenfranchised grief. All of those things that are not beautifully socially acceptable can be disenfranchised grief. So there are all kinds of ways of dealing with loss. And what we do is we get overwhelmed and we say, ugh, so we keep moving. And as a community, we say a lot of, you'll get over this, just hang in there, it will get better. And we mean well, we really mean well. But do you know anybody that really wants to hear you'll get over this? Because you don't think you will at the time. So those are the basic things of the framework for grief. And within that framework, we have to learn all of those things that make up a way to get back to using this terrible thing, and very frequently the worst thing that's ever happened to us, as a springboard for changing our lives and making them better. I have a friend who lost her 7-year-old child to neuroblastoma, 4 years of 2 bone marrow transplants. And she said, this was my choice. I could get under the bed and never come out, which I certainly understand. Or I could do something with this grief that made me a better person and the world a better place, because otherwise it didn't matter that she was here. And I had a volunteer at hospice whose 20-year-old son had committed suicide. And I said to her, when do you think you start grieving? And somebody in the room said, oh, when somebody gets sick or you get the news. And she said, oh, no. She said, you start grieving When somebody you love, like your child, is in the cradle and you say, I love that person so much that someday there will be some kind of loss and I won't be able to bear it. And I thought only a mother who loses a child would think that. So grief is profound. It is all-inclusive. It is no respecter of anything. And if we haven't gone through it, we will. And that social worker I was in 1979 sadly had to learn the hard way, but we do learn the hard way. And somebody said to me the other day, you need a new hobby. This death and grief thing is really getting old. Everything you post on Facebook is about death and grief. All your things are about death and grief. When you read a book, it's about death and grief. Couldn't you take up knitting or something? And, you know, yeah, I'm a little obsessed with it because I think it is the greatest opportunity in the world for people to find a part of their soul that we keep hidden so much of the time. So as bad as it is, the universe has that flip side of, guess what? Here's your chance.
Sheridan.
Tough act to follow. Hi, I'm Sheridan Hill, and I host a very simple grief circle in Black Mountain. I know a few of you guys, and I wonder if you would humor me by closing your eyes for a moment. And if you came here because you yourself have grief, so now this is when you would close your eyes, would be now, because I'm going to ask for a show of hands, and I wanted the show of hands to be anonymous, so if you close your eyes. And if you came here because you personally have some grief, would you raise your hand just briefly? Thank you. Okay, thank you. My whole piece is about the feeling part. I'm just here to bring in the body and the breathing and how grief moves in us, whether we're admitting it here in our heads or not. So maybe just right now, make sure you're breathing, you know, deeply, because we get all excited and kind of anxious and everything about the topic, and just breathe into your body and feel your body and feel your heart. So for me, this whole topic of grief, what grief is and what it isn't, has so much to do with being conscious about your feelings. Everybody is worried about being in a room full of people sharing a sad story. Like, nobody wants to go to a grief circle because they don't want to have to be around other people saying the sad stuff. And I mean, literally, I've talked to yoga teachers, very important, highly trained people, and the real work is, can you be present with somebody else's grief and not do anything about it? And what I tell people in the grief circle that I have in my backyard around a fire pit, and if it's weather doesn't permit, we do it inside, is we are practicing the opportunity to be present with your feelings while somebody else is experiencing and expressing something sad like their loss. And what we're practicing is how to not do anything, how to actually hold it. And I say, what's the best thing to say to a grieving person? Nothing. Because the one thing a grieving person can't get is somebody who will just let them feel what they're feeling. Seriously, if you can give an actual grieving person 3 whole minutes, just count them, 3 whole minutes, it's huge. And I know my background has been biography and newspaper writing, magazine writing, and my whole career has been about sitting with people, getting their whole life story, and getting all their stories in a magazine or in a book, most recently in the last 20 years in book form. And what I know is the important part about knowing your story is releasing your story. Eventually, we have to come out of the story. These things happened to me. These people I love did these things that caused me to experience grief, whether they meant to or not. And there's nothing I can do about that. As we all know, and the older I get, the more I really know this, the only thing I'm in control of is how I respond. How I respond to what's happening. So we, in the grief circle I host, and there are little cards for it over there, we practice just, being in your body, breathing in, and we give people this great spaciousness. And what I want you to know, if you don't remember one thing I say, please believe me when I tell you this one thing, that when you sit in circle, I don't know about other shapes because I only do a circle. When you sit in circle with people and you give them that spaciousness where the guidelines are, we all agree there's no crosstalk, there's no trying to help, there's no trying to fix, just making space. What happens is everybody gets lighter. That's the one takeaway I want you to please believe me. We fear that one thing that really is the medicine. Malidoma Somé is an African healer, comes here a lot. He says alienation is the greatest sickness of modernity, of this modern age that we live in. And the cure is a new sense of togetherness. So I believe and I say, here we all are, white people, here we all are in this culture, this privileged culture, and we think it's our job to go around and wear nothing but a smiley emoji all the time. And nothing could be less authentic. Nothing could be less real. Nothing could be really less useful to our children, our family, our friends. I'm one of those people who I cry very easily. I almost think lately I cry almost every day. But I'm also one of the most joyous, creative, super alive, vibrant people because of it. It's because I'm releasing all the time whatever I can release, going to yoga, talking to friends, singing with people, musicians, and one of my musician friends is here, Kim Hughes. Do you guys know Kim Hughes?
Yes.
So, Kim, will you come over and we'll do a little, I couldn't help it when I saw her walk in. So, calling all angels, this is just, I invite you to take this in as yourself, or if you know somebody who really just needs some good light and mojo. I'm a Quaker, and so we hold people in the light. That's our thing. So if you know somebody that needs some healing light, or if you want it for yourself right now, then just absorb this. It's just a verse from a song from Ma Muse. If you don't know Ma Muse, look her up on YouTube. She's awesome. And it's to call in the angels to help, because when you're grieving, one thing I believe is you cannot do it yourself. You got to get with other people, and you got to call on some kind of higher power. This is my thing, some kind of higher power. If you don't have one, Mother Nature is a pretty fine higher power, I think. So this helps call in the angels.
It's going to be high.
Calling all angels.
Yeah, that's good.
Calling all angels.
Calling all angels.
Calling all angels. Okay. We're going to do this 3 times. Calling all angels, here to guide you. Calling all angels to surround you. Calling all angels to walk beside you. Love, may you walk on solid ground, on solid ground.
You want it higher? Calling all angels here to guide you. Calling all angels to surround you. Calling all angels to walk beside you. Love, may you walk on solid ground, on solid ground. Here, thank you.
Box here, it's my tools for transformation for grief. So later I'll just pull some of those out, but my piece of this is you need a toolbox for grieving. I feel like it comes to us, we don't have any tools, and we think, well, I'll get a tool, I'll read a book, I'll look up the latest theories, I'll get a counselor. All those are really good things, but you need a box of tools, not just one or two. So anyways, thank you.
I was reading some about the process and the steps that you mentioned you go through. There are other things that seem to kind of interfere, things like guilt and blaming the person and fear about what's going to happen to you. So I wonder if y'all could address those things.
There are about 1,000 more.
But how do you deal with them, I mean, outside the parameters of like normal grief?
I think that probably is normal grief. I can't imagine not having that. The guilt that goes with so much of death, even when you absolutely know intellectually that there is nothing you could have done, there is no way you could have stopped it, that you did the best you could, there's almost always guilt, almost always. And as women in this culture, we are programmed to feel guilty because that's our job, and we do it well when grief comes along. All those other things, the anger that goes, if you start at the beginning of holistic grief and you look at the emotional end of it, there is guilt, there is anger, there is resentment, there is fear, there is everything you mentioned, and then so many more things, because you don't become a different person the minute that your circumstances change. All of those things that have gone with you in life are exacerbated usually by the absolute horror of the grief and what you've gone through. So what's the worst thing that you can do to yourself in the process of grieving, of losing somebody? What? Not do it. Well, that's it on top of it, is to pretend that those things don't exist because we feel like we shouldn't feel those things. And what Sheridan was saying is, those are your feelings. But everybody has an opinion about your feelings too, I'd like to point out. And so when you sit in grief circle with Sheridan, you learn that your opinion doesn't matter, and that the biggest gift you can give somebody is to take in what they're feeling. So not doing it is it in a nutshell. If you say, I'm not even going to deal with this anger, how about the anger at God in a death? How about your religious faith being shaken because your child died, because your spouse of 60 years died? I had a case at hospice, and in one group I had a 30-year-old wife whose husband died of a brain tumor, and a 90-year-old wife whose husband died of the same diagnosis, in the same room 2 weeks apart at inpatient hospice. And so it was almost like a laboratory of, they began to compare what's worse, to be 30 and lose your husband and be angry because you didn't have your future, or to be 90 and lose your husband and be angry because it's over. There's no comparing grief. Grief is grief is grief is grief. But it was fascinating to listen to all the things that they went through that were similar, because the woman who had been married for all of those years and was 90 felt horrible about letting him die. The 30-year-old said, if I had gotten him to the doctor earlier, maybe he wouldn't have died. So all that you're talking about keeps coming through and coming through and coming through and coming through, and you have no choice but to go through it. You can't go around it, you can't go over it. That song of you just can't get there.
But you can bury it.
You can bury it. So what happens when you do that? Oh, it can kill you. It can kill you. So, medical doctor, it can kill you.
Well, and maybe, Aditi, maybe you could speak to this. I mean, I heard the word blame, and I think that's such a painful thing that does happen. Being a hospice doctor, I know you see this, that it's kind of like the worst comes out in people, and blame is a thing that just, it happens.
So I think my experience of caring for people at the bedside is that unresolved, or I don't even want to use the word unresolved, just not being mindful and experiencing all those emotions that we're talking about kind of creates this opportunity for these pent-up emotions just to explode. And that greatly impacts everybody supporting this one person dying in the bed, but also the one dying. So it's not a service to anybody, and not to mention the physical ailments that can ensue when you keep emotions inside. I had an experience personally, which, speaking of holistic grief, one of the things I'm exploring and interested in is communal ways of grieving, and how to bring that back, how to bring this idea of sitting in a circle and sharing back into our world. And some of you talked about in previous talks, did an end-of-life doula training, and part of that training was a day on grief. And I have very little experience in training on this topic, so I'm really enjoying this conversation. But in that circle, the teacher, the facilitator, Taryn Estes, brought in the work of Malidom Somé and Prechtel and all these different world leaders who were really educating us on indigenous ways and other ways of being with death and grief. And we sat in circle. I didn't know what to expect. I had a dear friend of mine died suddenly shortly before that circle, so I thought that was what I was going to emote. And what ended up happening was during the circle, which includes music and just holding a container for expressing and experience whatever comes through, what came out was intense emotion. I wept, and my whole body on a cellular level was remembering all the deaths that I had taken. See, it happens. All the deaths that I had witnessed and been so present for, but had just sort of lived my life and just kind of kept inside. And so that is really telling to me. That tells me that the power of emotion not being expressed, or not even knowing you need to express it, So the body knows, speaking to keeping things inside. And to this day, I feel it. As I'm telling you the story, I just feel this cellular memory. So, yes.
Somebody said something about other cultures and how they do this. And many of them, indigenous cultures, are much better at this than we are. And we can learn good lessons. But when I worked in Connecticut at Hospice, the staff of Hospice was primarily middle-aged and white. And in Connecticut, primarily middle-aged white and Catholic. Down here it would be primarily middle-aged white and Protestant, yes. But so let me tell you what happens when a middle-aged white Catholic staff encounters an indigenous grief, it panics them beyond belief. We had this lovely, lovely lady who died, and she was Haitian, and she had 8 Haitian children. And they wept and wailed and fell to the floor. Not that they were not expecting this, they knew how to do it. And it scared the bejeebies out of Hospice. So they said, oh my gosh, call Marlissa. She's the bereavement person. She'll know what to do. Well, you don't do anything. You close the door and you say, let me know if I can bring you water, and that's what you do. But they wanted it fixed, and they wanted it fixed then, and they wanted them out of the building, thank you very much, because they were loud. So I told them, and they'll never get over this. And I'm like, they'll be over it so much faster than the rest of us will, who come out of the room and go, isn't that lovely? And you know, we have no words, we have no permission to grieve. So I told this story to a group at Yale that I was training in the bioethics department, and they come from all over the world, and this girl from somewhere deep in Africa said, you people absolutely don't know how to do this. She said, we hire people that wail, and she said we pay them really well, and they do the wailing for us, and then we can just chime in without being any louder than they are, and it's lovely, and then we go home.
And the Irish do that too.
Absolutely.
And they pay the mourners because they recognize it's so valuable. It's so
Well,
valuable.
but we not only can't do it, we're just so frightened of the whole idea that people would wail. We don't wail. Protestants don't wail. Catholics don't wail. You know, white people don't wail. So
What about black people?
black people don't come to hospice in Connecticut primarily.
Don't?
I don't know what
Less
you see down
trusting,
here.
less
They are
trusting
less
of
trusting of the medical
End of life,
system.
medical system in general, and then.
With every
It's
right.
definitely
And their
where-
family.
But they will.
gathers
They will.
around and goes through the process as a unit.
Right.
And knows how to care for the body and knows how to care for the children and whatever. We say, oh my gosh, call the funeral home, you know, whatever. So very, very rarely did we see African American. Irritates hospice staff too, because you know, then we'll have to hold the body a little longer and not move on with this. So what I'm saying is that all the best people I know are hospice people. That's because that's my hobby, you know. That's who I hang out with. We still don't do it well, even if we know it, and even if we are exposed to it daily. The other thing about being exposed to it daily and having all that pent-up grief over your patients, over people you care for, is we learn to function by going on. And we believe that there is value in sucking it up and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and going on. We don't sit with it, which is why the circle, the idea of sitting with it, is so important. We move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's certainly true, I think, that one of the reasons we don't look at grief very thoroughly is that if we're going to look at grief, we have to look at death. And if you think there's a topic worse than grief, we certainly don't want to look at death. I worked for a woman at Connecticut Hospice who actually had been part of the Cicely Saunders team, and she was quite old when I worked for her, and the most powerful woman I ever met, and the craziest. And what she said to me was this: it is very bad business for you to talk about death. And I said, I'm sorry, this is hospice. She said, I would prefer that you call it upsetments. You can be the director of upsetments. Because every time you say bereavement, people say, people die in that building. And I thought, that's an exaggerated form. However, you know, yeah, people die in that building, and we don't know how to do that either. So we don't know how we should react to it because we don't know very much about it.
So I have two questions. One being, in your experience, what best prepares somebody to experience any sort of grief? And the other one is, what are like the top performers of grief doing that they're able to either incorporate it more quickly or move through it less? I don't, does that make sense? I know it's sort of...
Who handles it the best?
Yeah.
He wants to know what's the easy way out.
Or maybe who's a guide? Is that what you're asking for? Who would be a good guide?
Or what are
No,
some
I'm just
qualities?
asking, like, do they have a better attitude about life? Do they tend to be happier.
In other words,
In your
who's
experience.
resilient and who's not?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are all kinds of wonderful new books on who's resilient and who is not. That's a big term now, resilience. And so people are very interested in who can go through a tragedy and come out of it whole and come out on the other side, and who can go through the death of their 99-year-old mother easily and fall apart. Why? Is that, so this is what I know, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but we had a lot of people come and talk about that in Connecticut at Yale, and what they said was there is an inherent personality that deals with things better, but that personality is built from everything you've learned along the way, from your culture, from your family, from your religion, from your everything. So who knows what goes into making a resilient person? I don't know that anybody will ever know what goes into it. Why can some people handle things and others not handle things? That anticipatory grief, which is very, very crucial that people understand, is you don't start grieving when somebody around you suddenly dies or dies after a long. You start grieving way, way, way before. And maybe the other answer, and this is vague, is that if we cannot form communities that can talk about grief, that can talk about death, that can sit in circle, that will literally look this thing in the eye and say, nobody's getting out of here alive. We had a social worker who was 28 years old and came from a really amazing Ivy League college, and this is what she said when she came on board at Hospice. If I thought I were ever going to die, I would just do it differently. But you don't know that at 28 necessarily. And some people don't, that's right. And some people don't know it. But again, we are not communities that deal with this head on, and we better be.
Because you lived in love more fully.
I think death awareness. Andrew, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? I think everything we spoke about in the three sessions before this, and honesty, for me, my experience is people who are honest with what they're going through and their emotions, aware, fully, like again, back to mindfulness, and those who have a good community and support system, I've seen do well, are resilient.
I have a question for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was easy, wasn't it?
Oh, and she has something else too.
I did want to give you a couple of names, though, and I don't know if you caught Frances Weller that she mentioned in the beginning, W-E-L-L-E-R. So he's a person who is doing this well. And I don't know if you know Martine Prechtel. He has a school. He's an amazing Native American person who, if you go to YouTube and look up, somebody has videotaped, they just show the picture of him and then it's the audio, but it's a beautiful lecture that he once gave, and you can buy his lectures. He is doing it really well, and they're both role models, well, actually for all of us. Yeah. Prechtel,
The book is called The Smell of Rain on Dust, and if you haven't read The Smell of Rain on Dust, maybe, I'll ask you, Ariana, maybe we can send out a resource list, and we can email it. So the three of us can write down the things that we know that, you know. So I have a question about communal grief. And without getting political, I would say that, yeah.
We've been deep into grief.
Well, and so is that really true? Go. I know what
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm grieving our country right now, and I'm grieving the earth, and I'm just grieving everything. And I hope that doesn't offend anybody that's in the room, but I feel like we need to deal with that level of grief that we're all going through too.
Well, you know, when you turn on the news at night, if you are not grieving over the fact that we are burning and flooding and killing each other and all of that, then we're not conscious and not paying attention. But what do you do about that, and how do we handle that as a culture? Because we have to handle it.
I just had a question about anticipatory grief. If you could just talk about that. You said it's important.
Anticipatory grief is when you know something awful is going to happen because someone has been diagnosed with something and you know what's coming. and you're grieving for what is coming. And people who come into hospice have families who have been dealing with anticipatory grief a long time. Is it helpful? There are questions about it, but I think that it does help mitigate some of the things. And so, but I have to tell you, it can be as bad as after the fact. I think that when you know, and sometimes worse, that when you know somebody's going to die and you know you're going to watch that, and you can't get away, yes, that anticipatory grief, and we treat that at hospice, and I use the word treat very carefully, but we acknowledge it, but there's nothing to do about it except listen.
And except, I've had husbands of, wives who are dying who just cannot be present at the bedside. Don't come to see them. They just have said goodbye, but they're anticipating they're grieving in an anticipatory way. And so it can, again, directly impact how someone dies, with whom they die,
And the person who has not come to the bedside.
Has not come to the bedside.
There's your guilt for you. And so I did want to throw this in, and this goes back to a question, something we referenced. You actually can die of a broken heart, and you usually don't die of this syndrome. Is it called takabotu?
Yeah, I don't know how to spell
it.
It's
a Japanese word, takabotu,
Subo, thanks,
Subo, yes. Which is a heart condition, which is not really a heart condition, but it mimics a heart attack. It's the left ventricle filling up. I think the word means octopus trap or something crazy.
I'm not sure.
But it mimics a heart attack. So, we see people who absolutely don't find a way to handle this grief, and it builds up in the part of the heart that pumps the blood, and it gives you the same kind of thing. Generally, it resolves without, you can go into heart failure, I think, but generally it resolves. But people end up in the hospital all the time with a broken heart, which is really interesting. And that doesn't count all of the illnesses that we get from immune system depression, from that kind of grief and that kind of sadness non-expressed. Sloan Kettering, the Cancer Center in New York, did a lot of work on what happens to the immune system when you don't grieve and when you don't handle your anger as the patient and as the family. And they counted T cells. It goes down. So we know it's detrimental. Can you add something?
This lady was talking about how to modulate, or Linda was saying, how do you deal with grieving our country and our earth and everything. And I just remembered something, I think it was Joanna Macy wrote, which is pick two things. Yes. Focus on them, gather with others to address those two things, let the rest go. Some people can take more, some people can take less, but I just remembered that.
Instead of letting it all pile up.
Instead of thinking it's all your job.
Right.
Because no one person can address all of this.
I have a particular practice that I do in the face of that. So in the face of overwhelming grief, I do Ho'oponopono over and over and over again. And I also say, thank you for everything, I have no regrets whatsoever, which is the most difficult thing to do when my beloved California is on fire, or when I hear about a shooting. But Kuan Yin teaches that we don't know the whole story, and we don't know the deal that the person made. And so you have to say thank you, because you don't know we don't know everything. But instead of doing this with anger in a political way, if we instead show love, it's disarming and it doesn't feed the negative energy. So that's how I'm handling a lot, is I do a lot of Ho'oponopono and a lot of, I get in the shower and my brain starts going, it start, thinking critical things. I just heard something critical. And instead I stop and I say, thank you. I get in the ground, I anchor myself, and I breathe in and I say, thank you for everything. I have no regrets whatsoever. Or thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever, which is very hard, but it changes. Instead of putting out negative, I'm putting out as much positive into the into the world as I can.
It changes us, it changes the energy that we put out, so it changes everything else. Meister Eckhart said, if the only prayer you ever pray is thank you, that will suffice. You know, there's not a lot else to say these days.
Yeah, gratitude practice and death awareness to me are two of the things that help me the most.
Speaking of that, there's death cafes that Sethi and Greg and have been doing on in this community for a long time, but just to be able to come in and spend time dialoguing in a very small group about death, different aspects of death. And it's something that started in Europe, right? I mean, it's been going on for a long time in communities all over the place.
Yeah, and speaking of creative ways to engage and to communicate these, what we're talking about today, there are little flyers, quarter-page flyers that you can grab. We're doing a quarterly ceremonial grief concert, and it's an exploration, and it's been so powerful for us and for those that have attended. And it's again quarterly. It's coming up this Saturday, which is 2 days from now. It's at my home. Y'all are welcome.
At night?
At night. At 7:30.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and it's using music and storytelling to be with grief.
And the music is the sound bed, you know, so everything that's being felt just flows out on the music, and it's absolutely perfect and healing and calming and nurturing, and it's great.
Yeah.
So we recommend that you make grief your hobby, you know. but seriously, as to what you do to become resilient, you face it, you deal with it, you take advantage of these opportunities. Asheville is full of people who have trained as death doulas and who know this. And if you really want to make your family proud, tell them you're a death doula, and they go,
Are you crazy? Are you crazy?
Are you crazy?
I just wanted to share that, you know, when my mother died after 16 years of being told after she was told she had 6 months to live. So we were so grateful that we had had that extra time with her. But I was 35. And then 2 years later, my younger sister. But it wasn't until I was 40 and my 17-year-old son was killed in a car accident that I really fully understood that grief is physical. The body has to grieve. And so it doesn't matter necessarily whether it's singing or creating art, but there's got to be a physical component. And when I did the training with Francis Weller, that was a huge, you know, I see some of you have worked with him, and there's a huge component in there of actually moving the body. And that I just feel like that's an important part of allowing that release from the body, because the body has memory.
Yes.
Speaking of that, at the ceremonial grief concert a couple times back, a friend of mine, her parents died when she was 3 years old in a car accident. And she was raised by her grandparents, and she was abused by her grandfather. And during this grief ceremony, it was so powerful because she shared her story, and suddenly she started moving to the drums. And it was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever witnessed, because she was swirling and releasing how many years, 40 years of this grief and anger towards her grandfather. And how, you know, so the power of movement and drums, again, music in our case, and it's really powerful.
And
so thank you for sharing.
You're absolutely right, because we do, Amy and I have a grief service where we do grief groups and whatever, and the information is everything. She is a creative grief specialist, and so she does the art of grief. And it's really, you don't have to be an artist, you know, you have to be willing to pick up a brush and do what you want, or throw the pot, the clay or something, you know. But you have to release it somehow.
Maladona's amazing in speaking to, he comes here and he's usually speaking to white people, and so he says, You people spend 10 hours talking and 15 minutes drumming and dancing. We spend 15 minutes talking and 10 hours drumming and dancing. You know? That's how you work with it. That's how you get it out.
But in our culture, we get trained very early. The reason we don't deal with death is we don't deal with emotion. We don't deal. You know, a child comes home and was beat up, you know, it starts right at the very beginning of abuse or bullying. It's hidden, it's not talked about, so we have a very, very long history in this country of don't talk.
Don't cry.
Don't cry.
Don't cry.
Don't cry. And
Yeah.
so when we get, we've already learned this, you know, with the bootstraps, what is the number, right? Strip up her lip and all of the, so we've had
Especially
really
boys
good,
and men.
yes,
Yeah.
really good practice in this culture. So when we get to the point of death and grief, they're just doing what they've been trained or learned to do, our entire culture. Well, you know, go feel in the body. No, have a drink. Have a, you know, have a, you know, some pill. Yeah, don't feel it. So it's
Yeah.
it's an extension of what you need to start earlier. You know,
Exactly.
every other culture, when someone is dying, the whole family's there.
The children.
Children are there. When my first mother-in-law was dying, my son took his two daughters and they spent a couple of weeks so that the girls were gathering stories that they hadn't heard. It's a shame that some of those stories had to wait that long, but at least, you know, they were getting the stories, they were getting that connection that was going to be lost.
Yeah, so I feel called to share something about storytelling. Can I share? Carolyn Wallace here. She does legacy letters for people who are dying to share, or for anyone. Facilitate, right. Their own, and then and as individuals we can do them as well in the living, even though we're not actively dying. And then Sheridan doing biography. And so for me, something that is missing is remembering our ancestors and having a way of doing that as a society. You know, like the Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico, there is something in Pittsburgh, North Carolina, they're starting a death fair. It's the 3rd annual, and it's an attempt to sort of bring some of this into a festival setting so we can honor, and this altar and all these ways of remembering those that have died. I think that is a piece that we forget.
You just reminded me of something that people forget, is that until the person dies, you're still in a relationship with them.
Yes.
And after the
And
person
after
dies,
the person dies, still in a relationship with them.
No, but well, yeah, but I mean, you know, this is one thing people they talk about. Oh, he's dying. I mean, I loved being with my brother for 3 weeks while he was dying. I loved it. Just to see him every day, and, you know. I mean, I knew he was going to come to me after he died, and he did finally. But that's sort of a different. It's a different category, I think, if I put it in categories. It's just, you know, oh, my brother's going to die, my brother's going to die, my brother's going to, all this anxiety that you were talking about. And then when he's actually dying, the fear of the intimacy. Oh my God, am I going to have to look at his private parts? Am I going to have to do this, you know, all these things? And then it didn't turn out to be that bad. It was just another level of intimacy and relating to somebody that was so beautiful. You know, part of my brother that I didn't even know. I didn't even have that relationship. So I don't know where that fits in the context.
So it's an opportunity.
Opportunity. I wanted to share.
You can say, you know, live your life as this is a good day to die. So, you know,
It's beautiful.
very much like the Buddhists.
Right.
Theirs is today is a good day to die, meaning that you've got your house in order and
Right.
you're living in the present.
That's beautiful. I wanted to share, Carolyn, what you said reminded me of something Stephen Jenkinson talks about. He says that love and grief are connected, as love is a way of grieving that which is not yet gone. Grief is a way of loving, and love is a way of grieving. They need each other to be themselves.
I discovered after my son Logan died that the second year was actually harder than the first. But I knew that if I allowed myself to do my grief work, well, let me just say, it showed itself to me that the more I did my grief work, the closer to him I felt. So as I went through the grieving process of letting go what my future was supposed to look like and what I felt like he would have become, I was able to be more fully present for the love that is still between us.
Yes. Amen. Did anyone bring, there was an email that said if you like you could bring a symbol of your grief. The point is to put it on the table here.
Yeah.
So is it just one person? One brave person? Couple brave. So could we go ahead and do that now? And Kim and I will sing this song and just, just.
I put a picture of my mother with her red bacon soup.
Yeah. Take a moment placing it there, and what about every time?
Yeah.
Every time I go into the depths of me, stars glitter brilliant of jewels. Every time I go into the depths all around me, stars glitter brilliant of jewels. Maybe do three. Midnight velvet wraps all around me, stars glitter brilliant above. Midnight velvet wraps all around me, stars glitter brilliant above. Every time I go into the darkness, I return with fistfuls of jewels. You know, the idea of the table and the beauty, one of the tools to me is the tool of beauty. That where there's grieving, there has got to be beauty. There's got to be, for me, there's got to be fire, candles, stones, to make some kind of a memorial space. And we've talked a little bit about white people versus indigenous people, and indigenous people all over the planet make, they might call it an altar. We're calling this a memorial table, but it's a way of remembering the person. So I'm confused. We're good?
I think everybody put their thing on the
It's
table,
the
right?
email sent
Yeah.
on there.
Yeah, okay, perfect. This is like an emergency kit. Kim and I talked about calling our little group the Song Medics, and we could be just like called to come on site when people are really, really sad and sing for them, So in my toolbox.
She's not kidding.
No, we're not kidding. We're going to
Really?
t-shirts.
Do
Song
it.
Medics. So I
There's
have
another group doing that already.
Yeah, well, the Threshold Choir,
Yeah,
yeah, I know. I have, smell good stuff. I have flower essences, for sure, white sage. Do you know that it's been clinically proven that burning sage literally gets rid of bacteria in the room?
Right.
So it works at the spiritual level and at the clinical level.
You know that.
I have, my sister gave me, the coloring book is a thing now, and so she gave me this. And so I'm trying to be less of a deep thinker and sometimes color, playful, to remember to go back to play, because a lot of the pain of the grieving is all the why did that happen and why didn't this happen and why didn't, all that arguing and fighting. And so if you can return to play at all, that's very helpful. People have referred to the Buddhists, and So I have these tools. This is the Vajra knife. You see this in Tibetan Buddhist paintings. The Vajra knife is to slice through illusion so that reality can be experienced directly. And there's a lot of illusion involved in the grief and the stories we tell ourselves about all of that. But there are 3 pieces. So the other piece is the scepter, which goes in the other hand, which is all about balance. So you got to knife through, as Kali Ma said, let die what must die, so that what needs to be reborn can be reborn. So the scepter for balance. And then the bell is the 3rd. That's the moment, right? It's harder to stay stuck in the painful story if you're like right here in this moment. It's a second, it's a split second where you can come out of the pain of the story. So I won't pull everything out. I have a cloak. Make yourself like an invisible cloak. You might need to disappear sometimes. And
good night, guys. See you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. I have a rescue snake, and so this is this is her skin. But what I want to tell you about it is, before she's going to shed, her whole body goes all gray, and she literally looks like she's dead. It's just kind of sad looking. And then one day, after about a week or so of that, and you see how alive this shell looks, she's got a log she hides in. She goes in the log, and the log sloughs off the whole skin, and she is brilliant and shiny and just like, you know, just got born kind of a skin. And remind yourself that this whole journey is about transformation. It's about transforming these things that have happened to you and not being stuck in them, and knowing that you are so much more than the things that have happened to you and the people that you love. Right? So anyway, Toolbox. Get a Toolbox.
Thank you, Sheridan.
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah. The cloak. She wants to see the cloak.
Oh, well,
we have
I have 2 of them. I lived in Hawaii for a year and a half.
Like a shop.
Yeah, oh yeah, right. They're just really special, you know, batik, so that, you know, so that when I put them on, I feel, right?
Right, but you tell it cloak.
Cloak yourself. And you know, ladies, women hid in caves many, many, many times to stay hidden until, so they could do what they needed to do, so don't be afraid of going in your cave.
Thank you, Sheridan.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
And this is Martine Prechtel's book, The Smell of Rain on Dust. I'll leave this on the table. I was going to read a piece in here.
You have time.
Oh, it's so amazing. Also, keep reading glasses in your... Well, the grief and praise part, and we refer to this quite a lot. He autographed this one to our grief circle. Grief is a shameless dreamer. I'll just read parts of it. Grief is natural. To grieve the loss of what we love is as natural as peeing, eating, singing, dreaming, running, or looking for rocks, under rocks for bugs to feed your bug. Sorry, for bugs to feed your frog. Grief is an obligation to the life one has been awarded, an obligation to life to make more life. And I'm going to skip over because it's a beautiful poem, but here's the second part. Grief permeates life, and grieving can take many forms, but grief can never be outrun or simply thought away, transcended, or meditated into non-existence. Necessary grief, when shunned or unattended, can easily hide for years, even generations, in the skeletal structure of the family collective psyche. Like light, matter, sound, and energy, grief will eventually manifest, even among those in the future who did not consciously experience the loss. So it's best to grieve when it's time to save the world a lot of war and trouble. Grieving is a sacred art, not an art whose product should be sold or seen subjectively. Grief is not sorrow. Although there are stages of grieving that are sorrow-filled, real grieving refuses to remain in sorrow. Grief is a phenomenon that must be purposefully done, for grieving needs, and listen to this, it's so beautiful, grieving needs time and motion to allow the medicine of grief's dream to fully blossom into new life, to fill the loss. Grief is active movement, not stagnation, and real grieving never wallows. And he talks about the connection between war and nations who don't grieve. They go out and make war and make war and make war. So the final part of this, here's where he connects grief and praise. Grief is not depression, and a griever is not depressed. Depression comes from not being able to grieve, which converts our losses into violence. Grief is a shameless dreamer who thinks nothing of healing impossible despair head-on, of reionizing impossible situations, of healing impossible sickness, of depolarizing impossibly hard-headed people. Grief thinks nothing of impossibility, only of what makes life more deliciously alive. Grief doesn't care if he's badly misunderstood, underestimated, or forgotten. He's not hurt because people run away when they see him coming. Because grief has one real good friend. Grief is the best friend of praise. Because praise is a grandiose griever. Without grief and praise, life is really only hate and mediocrity. Grief and praise are renters whose landlord is love. Because they're, yeah, really. And this is the wrap up. Because they're best friends, both grief and praise live together in the same building, but in opposing quarters. In the left and right chambers of love's great thumping house called the heart. Together, both grief and praise work hard to print their own money, which they use to pay their rent to love. For theirs is the common currency of life's great beauty. Praise also has a sound that always moves and motivates, but never ends. One can only catch up within earshot of praise's sound or pull away. The praise of life never ends. Grief is a worker on life's big highways, and praise is grief's eternal freight train, forever hauling the vision of life's great picture from stars whose light hasn't got here yet. Praise is grief's voice. Oh, wait. Okay, here's the final part. Praise is grief's voice, and neither ever disappears, because they are the sound of all parts of the world and all parts of the universe, each living thing according to its own nature, each entire in itself, each a willing participant in the great prayer of praise, singing the world back to life. Martine Prechtel.
Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It was really special and rich for me, and I'm assuming for you too as well. And thank you again, IFMA, for Chad, hi, Dr. Cassell, who started, one of the founders of IFMA, and Ariana and Liz. Thank you. I can't think of a better way to close this 4-part series as this next film you're going to see. It's a 5-minute short clip. Do you want to introduce it at all? I want to say a few more things. We will send out an email with resources for grief support. On that table, you'll find the ceremonial grief concert information that's coming up this Saturday. Information about Sheridan's Grief Circle every Tuesday, every other, first Tuesday of every month, maybe. Second Tuesday. And then
there's the website.
There'll be information there, and Marlissa and Anne's great work in this community. There's some information there as well. So, and be on the lookout. I am in the process of working on the Center for Conscious Living and Dying. It's an online resource center for now, and it's in the works, but hopefully you can access all this information there, all the happenings that are going on in Asheville around this topic. And a calendar of events is my hope, too, around death and dying conversations. So thank you.
Thank you.
remorse, get curious about it, walk toward it and not away from